Okay, so next up on our docket here, we've got Dr. Greg Wideman. So Greg is a veterinarian and partner at Southwest. If you were at last year's producer meeting, you may remember Greg is kind of leading our clinic's efforts in terms of understanding high sow mortality in the industry. Today, on a bit of the flip side, Greg is going to be talking about sow livability. So sow livability is always a point of conversation in the industry and usually leaves a lot of us scratching our heads. During my first few months of practice, I was fortunate enough to visit a small sow barn in Denmark where I was shadowing a Danish vet. We took a walk through their farrowing room and it looked pretty much like back home, except there were a few extra pigs per sow in each of the crates. As we were leaving, I noticed on a whiteboard that there were 6 sow tag numbers written down. And it was near the end of August, so I was thinking, oh, maybe that's just August's sow mortality. So I asked the vet, and he told me that those were actually the mortalities for the entire year. Only 6 sows. So this had me flabbergasted, and so I had to ask the producer and had the vet translate, what's his secret? I need to know, I need to bring this back home. So we asked the producer what the secret was. And like all of us, unfortunately, he kind of just scratched his head and said that he had no idea, he just tries to keep the sows happy. So although no one has cracked this case yet, this experience continues to be very aspirational for me and where our industry may be one day. Moving towards a future with improved sow livability, Greg will have some important insights today, which will hopefully help us better understand not only how to keep sows alive, but to allow them to thrive. Please help me in welcoming Greg.
Okay, thank you very much, Jordan. I'm going to check and see if you can hear me at the back. All right, thanks for the thumbs up. It's great to see you all. Thank you very much for taking some time this afternoon to visit with us about pig health and, in my case, sow mortality. I think I'm going to present from the floor, so I'm just going to grab this. And I have a mix today of some updates, some good news, hopefully some useful tips. And I actually cut some slides out just before the meeting started today, because I realized everyone in this room either owns pigs or works with pigs every day. So I'm hoping that I can buzz through the stuff I prepared, and then we can have time for a discussion or some question and answer, okay? So very quickly, I'm going to review a couple points that we brought up last year that we have some new information on, or that I just want to remind you about. I'm going to bring you some new information from Ontario about where we are at with sow mortality. And then I'm going to dig into some causes and some solutions, including, I think, a very interesting case study that I want to share, a good success story, and then some new ideas about sow weight and body condition, which I just continue to think are extremely important. If you were here last year, I want you to remember that we talked a lot about pelvic organ prolapse, which is a very discouraging problem to have in the farm. And I know that some of you are still having that problem, and it is so annoying how it comes and goes without clear reasons why. But I'm not going to talk too much about that today. If you were not here last year and you want information about prolapses, pelvic organ prolapses, go to YouTube and check my presentation from last year. It, I think, had some valuable information for prevention and treatment. But we're going to stay away from that today. Okay, I want to jump right in and show you updated information for sow mortality from Ontario. And I mean, I just want to thank this group for your effort and your investment in people. I think that's number one. And facilities, I think that's number two, that are good at keeping sows alive, because Ontario is unique in the world at keeping sows alive. What I'm referring to is right over here, 2024 year to date. I want you to look at that light blue bar. That blue bar tells us that in Ontario, an average of about 200,000 sows amongst about 170 farms. The average sow mortality is 7.4%, okay? That's lower than last year, and it's lower than any of the 5 years on the chart. And it's lower by 50% than what's reported in other regions. The United States is at 15 to 16%. Even other data from other areas of Canada is at 14 to 15%. So I congratulate you, and the expertise on how to care for sows is in this room. We're just very fortunate to be able to learn from you and sometimes provide some little tips as well. There's some other noise on this chart related to sows that are housed individually in stalls or in groups. And you'll see there, this chart refers to niche production. That's sows that are housed with bedding or outdoors. And I'm not going to get too much into that because the overall point of this slide is you're doing a great job. Keep it up. You know, notwithstanding what Jordan just told us about her experience in Denmark, sow mortality is not exclusive to North America as a problem. And I just wanted to show you a couple little pieces of brand new information that were presented earlier this year at the big European pig vet meeting. And so this is all information from Western Europe. You can see there we've got Spain, Italy, Portugal, and Denmark from 2 different studies. And we've got, you know, well over 1 million sows from those big pig producing countries. And they are having trouble keeping sows alive. They are the same as what we hear about from the Midwest United States, 15%. So this is not a North American problem, it's a global problem. Now, last year, if you just point your attention here, this is a slide from last year where we talked about housing and sow mortality. And I said, you know, there's not a lot of clear, consistent linkages, you know, between the type of sow housing you have and sow mortality. And I said, we need more information, more epidemiologic information. Well, I want to show you that we had some, again, at this meeting from earlier this year. So there's a study here from Brazil, and then below that, there's a study from Denmark. And in Brazil, they're still allowed to use stalls, and some people still do use stalls. And you can see that the mortality in stalls is lower than in any of the 3 types of group housing that are listed there. Not a lot lower, but a little bit lower. Down below in Denmark, they're not allowed to use stalls, haven't been for, I mean, basically my whole career. And you can see there's 3 different types of loose housing there. And the mortality is similar. It's high, but it's similar. So I don't think we can maybe learn too much from this slide from these farms in other countries, but it did stimulate us internally to ask, what does that look like in our own clinic? And the way we looked at that, and this is a little bit of a rabbit trail we're going down here, but I want to share it with you. The way we looked at that was we asked the question, if we identify our top 20 most productive sow herds in this province, how do they house their sows? Is there a trend or a pattern there? So we took 20 herds and we looked at their year-to-date production, and we're measuring in pigs weaned per mated female per year. And we all know that there's lots of questions in those calculations, so it is what it is. But these are very productive herds. The range, you know, the top herd is producing over 34 pigs per sow per year, and number 20 is producing almost 32. So they're very productive herds, good herds. How do they house their sows? Well, I was somewhat surprised by this chart and somewhat not surprised by this chart. So you can see that 3 of the common loose housing options that you guys are using are all represented in the top highest producing herds. Or to put that another way, am I allowed to say this? There's more than one way to skin a cat. So the walk-through ESF, that's where the sow comes in, gets fed, and goes out. And the back out ESF, that's where the sow walks in, gets fed, and then has to back out. And then the free access stall, right? That's where the sow can choose to either be in her stall or not in her stall. There's 4 of each of those types of herds in our top 20. Now, what was a little more maybe surprising was that there's also systems here where sows can or have to compete for their feed. So in a shared feed drop in a pen, or in shoulder stalls, the sows are competing for their feed. Now, there's only 3 out of 20 farms where sows are required to compete for their feed. I think that's significant. But for the experts in this room who figured out how to do that well and are really watching for what's going on with their sows, it can work. I think one of the most interesting findings amongst these 20 herds is right here at the bottom. It has nothing to do with how their dry sows are housed. But when we look through this list of names, we realize that in this group, we have a whole bunch of owner operators who are in the barn every day. Or, and that's 15 out of 20. Or we have barns where we have a manager that somehow, for some reason, treats that barn as if it is his or her own. And that's the key. That's the key. I said it last year too, that an engaged owner operator or a very skilled manager can make any housing system work. I am leery of systems which require sows to compete for feed, and we're going to talk a lot more in the second half of this presentation about body condition and how important it is. And it just stands to reason that when a bunch of sows are competing for an amount of feed, you're going to have some changes in body condition, and that's a risk. So we'll come back to that. So this, I think, will look familiar, again, for those of you who were here last year. I wanted to look at the causes of sow mortality. Why do sows die? So these are lactating sows. There we go. There's 3,000 of them. And we're going to ignore this unknown cause of death for 2 more slides, and then we're going to deal with it. But if we take unknown out of the mix, sudden death is number 1. Pelvic organ prolapses is number 2. Lameness is number 3. Are you surprised by that? No. Everybody knows those are the 3 most common causes that sows die. These are open sows, so they're no longer pregnant or not pregnant, and they're not lactating. These will be sows that maybe lost their pregnancy, maybe were nursed off and are no longer raising a litter. Could include open gilts as well, excuse me. So we have our unknown, and then in these sows are mainly going to be out somewhere in the dry sow barn. We have lameness and downers together as the number 1 cause of death. We have sudden deaths, and then we have body condition. So sows that have just lost too much body condition and they don't survive. Rounding this out, we're in gestating sows now. Sorry about that. Got a little loud for a moment. And sudden death's number 1. Followed by lameness and downers put together, followed by prolapses. So this is nothing new. The causes of sow mortality are sudden death, lameness, and pelvic organ prolapses. But what are we going to do about these unknowns? I understand why we say unknown as a cause of death, and it's correct. Like most of the time, we don't know what bug or what weird internal problem happened that caused that sow's death. So you're not wrong when you put that in. I just think that we can add a little more information, which is valuable, if we stop using unknown as a cause of death. And so I have a slide here that is a replica of some laminated sheets that I think you saw out on the table on your way in. These are the 12 causes of death for sows that we at Southwest would like you to use. And if you start looking at that, I'm sure many of you will immediately say, well, that won't work for my farm because you're missing X, Y, or Z. But the more farms that we have using a standardized set of death and euthanasia codes, the better quality our data is to try and learn something from the group's data. And so when a sow is found dead and we're standing there looking at her and saying, well, we don't know why she died, and believe me, that happens to me all the time too. People will show me a sow and I don't know why she died. There's 2 choices that we can make. We can say, well, she was healthy the last time we saw her and she ate, so she's a sudden death. We don't know why, but she's a sudden death. Or we can say down at the bottom, well, she was sick. She didn't eat. We don't know why. Now she died. So she was an off-feed sow that died. And I think we could put most of our 2,500 unknowns into one of those 2 categories simply by asking, was she sick before she died or not? And that would help us because the actual conditions that cause sudden death are somewhat limited in sows. So it'd be helpful to have a little more definition on where we put those sows. Okay. sermon over, next year's talk, there'll be 0 unknowns, right? There's one other thing that I wanted you to pick up on when I showed those charts, and it's in the red there. I wanted you to pick up on the fact that 40% of all the deads in a barn occur in a very short time period, between 106 days of gestation and day 3 of lactation, okay? So that's essentially a 3-week period. Or if you spend some time chatting with our colleague Paul Ferreira, Paul likes to talk about how a sow herd is actually 21 groups of sows, 1 per week, right? 16 weeks of bred sows, 4 weeks of lactating sows, and then 1 week of open sows. If you think about it that way, and you think about sow mortality, you need to pay close attention to 3 of your 21 groups of sows. Only 3, okay? When you go in the barn in the morning with your team, find those 3 groups of sows and pay close attention to them, because if you're going to lose a sow, 40% of the time it's in that small group of sows. That was interesting to think about. Why is that? Well, why is farrowing, or 2 weeks before farrowing and 1 week after farrowing, so risky for a sow? Well, I think we know this, but I want to go over it again because there's some details in here. I like to talk about it, you've maybe heard me talk about lack of fitness. What I mean by that is that out in that dry sow barn, a sow or gilt that is getting less fit through gestation, she can hide on us. And we don't realize until we go to get her and bring her down to the farrowing room that she's not fit. So she's got a bad foot or a bad leg, or she's lost a bunch of weight, or something else is wrong with her. But because she hasn't flagged us by not eating, usually, and staying alive, we don't realize she's not fit until it's too late. That's why so many of them are found at farrowing time, and then something happens. Of course, the gilt is unique. She's got some unique behavioral stuff that happens around farrowing. She's never been in a farrowing crate before. She doesn't like it. She's never drank out of that water nipple or eaten out of that feeder before. And then we get to the pain and the stress of farrowing itself, and some gilts don't react well to that. We know that. There are a lot of metabolic and immune things going on inside the sow prior to farrowing and at farrowing. Her metabolism switches from growing fetuses inside her body to producing milk, first and foremost. That's a huge hormonal change. It requires a whole bunch of hormones getting shut off and a whole bunch of other hormones getting turned on. And that's a very stressful event for the sow. The immune system basically gets shut off at farrowing. It's part of the farrowing process that the immune system is told to just shut off. So if there's infectious diseases present, and there always is because it's a pig farm, that's a challenging time for the sow. This one, think about whether or not this applies on your farm, but I've seen it where our staff are excellent at keeping baby pigs alive. I always refer to those people as the midwives of the farm, right? The people who are responsible while the sow's giving birth to keep the baby pigs alive. Some of you are excellent at that, very skilled. And sometimes we forget that there's also a sow in the crate. So the piglets are fine, but the sow's not fine. And maybe we don't notice it on day 1, we don't notice it till day 2 or day 3, and then maybe too late. And then down at the bottom here, I'm not sure if you can read that, but I just wanted to reference a couple things that back in the old days when I was a dairy vet and then I became a pig vet, I thought, hey, I wonder if sows and cows are the same. And they're not. That's the short answer. They're definitely not. And people have looked, not just me, but other people have looked too. Cows get a condition called ketosis. It's negative energy balance. All of a sudden they have to produce all this milk and it totally screws up their metabolism and they can have problems with their liver. That doesn't happen in pigs. People have looked for it. It doesn't really happen. Same with milk fever. Milk fever is hypocalcemia, low calcium. It can make a downer cow, make a cow die. And any mammal can get low calcium, but cows are special because of the way they're fed and managed, that they get milk fever and sows really don't. Okay, so if you got a healthy sow that's eating and drinking and farrows, she's not going to have ketosis or milk fever. So those deficiencies are not part of the story. But I do want to point out one that is pretty much brand new and is very interesting, and that's anemia, which is not enough hemoglobin in the blood. It's common in other mammals like people to have iron deficiency anemia during pregnancy. They watch pregnant mothers for it, they treat pregnant mothers for it. And this brand new study, in a presentation that was actually given, I think on Monday or Tuesday of this week down in Minnesota, this master's student from South Dakota State checked a bunch of pregnant sows for anemia. Over half of them were anemic. They didn't have enough hemoglobin in their blood. This has been done before. We know that a whole bunch of sows are anemic during pregnancy. But what we don't know is how to fix it. And we also don't know for sure how important it is. It definitely increases farrowing duration and increases stillbirth, so that's bad. But does it contribute to sow mortality? Well, we still don't know for sure, but look at the last line on this slide. The anemic sows, and that was 50% of the sows in their study, their removal rate was double. It was 40%. 40% of the anemic sows never farrowed again. So I think we need to be careful doing too much with this today. We don't measure hemoglobin in sows today. We can, but we don't. But this is a very interesting area of inquiry because it makes sense to me that a sow with low hemoglobin might be a sow that has trouble surviving the farrowing test. So we need to know more about this. Just thought I'd bring that up. So we know when sows are likely to die, right around farrowing. But if we look at your herds, what are the risk factors that would make your herd a high herd for mortality versus a low herd for mortality? Well, there's a lot of information on this, and some of it's quite new. So let's just go through it quickly. Large herds have more sow mortality than small herds. Does that make sense? I think it makes sense. I think it just requires more people on the team, all understanding what are we going to do as a team to keep these sows alive. Then in a small herd, which might just be the owner and maybe the owner's family member, it's a smaller team. It's easier to stay coordinated. Sows are more likely to die in summer than winter. Does that make sense? Yeah, that makes sense. Hot, heat stress in the summer. You know, you guys have invested a lot in loose housing facilities. In loose housing facilities, there's more square feet per sow, and there's less heat stress and less death due to heat stress. So that's a real plus of loose housing that I want to mention. We already talked about group housing, so we won't say anything more. Sow herds where antibiotics are used in the sow feed have lower sow mortality than herds where antibiotics are not used in the sow feed. That makes sense. Sometimes there's bugs. Antibiotics can control bugs. Okay, I highlighted body condition score here because I want to remind us that we're going to talk more about that in a few minutes. But when it comes to body condition, it comes back to the gilts. And if you have gilts that are light or heavy when they're bred, they're not going to last. For slightly different reasons, and I'll get into that. But body condition score or body condition, weight, overall body composition of gilts is extremely important. And then if you do have sows that are, sorry, I keep losing sight of that. If you do have sows that have either a really, really high or a really, really low body condition, they're really at risk for other diseases, lameness, pelvic organ prolapse. So it's doubly important. The PRRS one, I know how many of you have suffered through PRRS, and yeah, we can't stand PRRS. It's so unfair to those of you who are such excellent managers that PRRS keeps happening, and I wish it didn't. But PRRS contributes to sow mortality. We know that. And there's even a study now in the US where they looked at the sow mortality rate in filtered barns versus unfiltered barns. It's lower in filtered barns because they don't break with PRRS or mycoplasma or less flu as well. And that's very important. And then last year we talked a little bit about water treatment and this concept of perennial scoring. We'll just leave that alone today because that relates to pelvic organs. Here's the case study I wanted to show you. And this is very interesting. This comes from Iowa Select Farms, a very large farm in Iowa. And they were unsatisfied with their sow mortality. So they took one 4,000 head farrow wean herd in their business. I think there are over 200,000 sows. So this is one of their many, many sow herds. It's a PRRS positive, myco positive, flu positive herd, so the same as everyone here, basically. And it's still installed, so keep that in mind. And the sow mortality before this intervention was 16.75%, very high. What they did was they brought a vet in from Iowa State University, and that vet and the gestation barn manager every day assessed every sow in that herd. So at feeding time, one of them walked in front of the sow, one of them walked behind, and any sow that wasn't eating or wasn't getting up or looked otherwise bad, they stopped and had a conversation and made a treatment plan. And they did that for 2 weeks straight, 14 days in a row. And you can see what happened to their weekly number of dead sows before and after that intervention. That intervention was very effective. It reduced the sow mortality by 4%. And it was sustainable for the rest of the year after the training period was done. So 12.5%, still way higher than what a lot of you folks in this room are achieving, but it was very markedly successful. Iowa Select didn't stop there. They made this their mission in their system to try and really hammer sow mortality down. And if you read not the Ontario Hog Farmer, but the National Hog Farmer, you'll have seen this last December. I thought it was really good. The 10 things that they're doing on their farms to try and continue to have low sustainable sow mortality. And a couple things on this list are simple little tactics, okay? So I'll just point out two of them. Number 3, they decided to hand feed all their sows post-term. That makes sense. It's a simple little tactic that I think is sensible. Number 8, they decided to trim long toes off any sows that had long toes. That makes sense. There's some sows that are going to get injured or just can't walk because their toes too long. But what I really wanted to talk about in this list of 10 action items was number 1, number 2, number 9, and number 10. Because those items all relate to capacity building with the people in the barn. And I think that's the key. So number 1, they started having weekly reports and weekly conversations about sow mortality, engaging the whole team in the problem and the solution. Number 2, they went to 100% team shoring. So they said this deal where the vet and the gestation manager did walk together and did health check together, that really worked. So we're doing that everywhere. So I think they have a lot less team members now kind of going on autopilot, if you know what I mean, because they've got teams of more than one person working together. These are huge farms. An individual person can get really burnt out looking at sows, so the team works better. Number 9, in the breeding barn, when the staff are going through, they call it a flash card, but it's just a daily card of how many sows did we treat, how many sows did we move if we're moving them out of pens into stalls for special care. And they're comparing notes on that every day, every single day. How many sows did we treat today, more or less than yesterday? So it's engaging the staff much more in the work they're doing of caring for the sows. And then number 10, which I really like, they do sow livability quizzes. So they're trying to build the capacity amongst their staff. What are the major factors that determine whether a sow will live and die? Let's learn about those, and not just as vets and managers, but include the whole team. And then again, I highlighted body condition scoring because Iowa Select scores every sow at least twice during gestation, more in the barns where they're putting sows in the pens. Okay, so I said we were going to come back to body condition, and that's what we're going to do now. The size, shape, and composition of sow's body has really changed in the time we've been working with pigs. Today's genetics have been selected for really fast growth, lean growth, and efficiency. And that's because of the pig we want to finish the barn. We all know this. It is especially important to understand this raising our gilts, because the gilt wants to grow this fast. We don't want her to grow that fast. That will cause lameness. That her legs cannot support that growth. So we want to manage the gilt's growth curve. But that's very hard to do because how do you slow her down without getting into trouble with vices? I mean, we've had this conversation on many farms. Today's gilt needs perfect rearing conditions. Enough space, enough feed, enough water. Can we provide perfect rearing conditions? No, we can't on those farms. And so we are constantly trying to figure out what's realistic to raise our gilts. But having said that, I make a point here in bold that gilt condition at breeding, and I mainly mean weight, which I'll show you, is a critical control point for sow mortality. Sows that are too heavy or too light when you breed them, I won't say they're doomed, because that's not true. You're very good at keeping all sows alive, but it's much harder. Thankfully, all the genetics companies, and I have 4 examples here, are providing us good guidance on how to raise the gilts that they produce, okay? And so you can see here that for all 4 of these common companies with fast-growing lean gilts are telling us how old and how heavy the gilt should be when she's bred. And I just pulled these off the internet. So if they're slightly different than what your genetics person told you, go with what your genetics person told you. But this is what is published, okay? So we know where to start, and I want to show you how important that is in a couple slides. But then, assuming we've got the gilt bred at the right weight, how do we manage condition after that? Well, historically, we use visual body condition scoring, and I put it in my presentation twice, this old picture of the sows lined up facing the other way with body condition score 1 to 5. It's very easy to implement. Unfortunately, it's not very accurate. And there's other options which can replace visual scoring. There's calipers, which are suitable for some genotypes, but not all. There's measuring tapes of various kinds, which again are calibrated for some sows, but not all. And then there's live weight at the far side. Live weight is by far the most accurate for one user, and especially between users. And it's, by far the most objective way to understand the condition of your animal. Unfortunately, it's the highest cost and hardest to implement. But if we can get live weights, it's really, really helpful. We have some clients who are working very hard at implementing weight and condition management to try and keep their sows in the herd longer. Okay, so this is one herd, and in this herd, they're weighing every gilt at the time of breeding. And the target that they're aiming for is 135 to 160 kilos. And they're not perfect. In fact, just over 50% of the gilts are in the window. So look at this slide and understand with me how important it is, especially to not breed gilts that are too light. When you look at those gilts, which are under the weight for their genotype, the number of them that are removed for prolapses, either uterine or rectal, is at least 2 times, maybe 3 times as high as pigs that are bred in the right weight range. And also true for lameness. You can see they have removed 9 of those light gilts and only 6 of the gilts that were in bigger weight ranges. Now, I don't think this is a surprise. This is what we've been talking about. A gilt that is, too light when she's first bred is going to have a really hard time navigating loose housing and farrowing. But this puts the numbers in front of us. Now, the overweight gilts, they have their own set of problems, and we'll get to that in a moment. And one of them is they're not very good at farrows. They have too many stillborns, too much fat inside that birth canal. And in this data, it would appear that the gilts that were bred at the right weight or overweight actually were worse for sudden death. I don't know what to make of that. I can't necessarily make up a story that explains that. But it is interesting, and it maybe speaks to the fact that when we say sudden death, we don't know what happened, right? Here's a second herd, doing the exact same thing, slightly more successfully. These guys are over 60% of their pigs are being bred in the target window. And So there's not quite as dramatic of effect on prolapses there, but again, for lameness, you can see that those gilts that are bred light, they're just not fit, and so they're succumbing to lameness. And again, you can see that the stillbirths are a little higher in those bigger, older girls. But most of us can't weigh the sows. We don't have a scale. We certainly don't have some kind of automatic scale. And so let's look at some age data, not weight data, okay? So this is actually a larger group of 16 herds. It's thousands of gilts, as you can see, that have their age recorded when they're first inseminated. And if you look at the chart here, I want to show you that what we're looking at here is how long did those gilts last in the herd? And I've highlighted the gilts that were over 260 days of age when they were first bred. Why 260 days of age? Well, with 260 days of age, we think we are above the recommendation for any genetics company. Doesn't matter who you buy your gilts from. Everybody will say, make sure they're bred by 260 days of age if you can. And if you can't, so in this data set, those 12% of gilts that were bred older than 260 days of age, you can see as we move out from P1 to P2 to P3 to P4, they just don't last, okay? The retention is far lower than younger gilts. Here's a farm that has the capability of weighing their gilts into farrowing and out of farrowing. And so we're looking at a whole bunch of gilts here. Each dot's a gilt. And on the horizontal axis, we have the weighted farrow. And I think this data needs to be cleaned up because it's suggesting that some gilts weighed as little as 140 kilos at farrowing. I'm not sure about that. We might need to cut off some weights that are not accurate. And as large as 260 kilos at farrowing, which could be true. And then on the vertical axis, we have the weights from when they leave the farrowing crate, and we're calculating how many kilos of weight they lost. Some gilts gained weight, and some lost a lot of weight. And the slope of that curve shows us that the heavier a gilt was when she went into farrowing, the more weight she lost. Have you seen that on your farm? I'm assuming you have. A gilt that is quite big and heavy sometimes won't eat in the farrowing crate and loses weight. It's the same data from another farm. Much tighter window of weights at farrowing, but the same slope of the line. A big, over-conditioned gilt is gonna lose a lot of weight in farrowing, and that's a problem. I'm gonna summarize that in a moment. Right here, as a matter of fact. So why don't we like gilts that lose a bunch of weight in farrowing? Well, I think that's a risky animal that's gonna need to be pulled out, nursed off, and wean zero pigs. That's no good. We have tons of born alive these days. We can't be nursing off sows that wean zero. We need them to wean pigs. They're at risk for mortality. So a sow that loses a bunch of weight is a huge risk for a prolapse. We can't have that. And I'm sure you've all seen this. What happens to that sow that loses a bunch of weight in farrowing? She weans a litter of pigs, that's great. But then what? Then she doesn't come back and eat, right? That weight loss, the scientific word for it is cachexia or cachexia. That's a signal, don't get pregnant again. This is a bad time to get pregnant. That's exactly what that sow does. Animals that come into the farrowing barn too heavy or fat, they may survive, but they're gonna have stillbirths and they're gonna have poor milk production because inside that udder is not milk producing cells, it's fat cells. And we know that those big old sows are not going to last in the herd as long for lameness, prolapses, just litter production. And the too light or thin at farrowing, I hope I've made a good point already that we really want to avoid those. They don't last. They're not fit to do the farrowing process. I'm almost at the end here, but the one thing I haven't really addressed at all yet is this question of lameness in sows. I mean, lameness is either number 1, 2, or 3 cause of mortality in every farm. What are we doing about lameness? It comes back to the gilt. I'm sorry to say, but it does. When we have a gilt that's too heavy at breeding, she's very likely to have osteochondrosis, okay? That's a condition, it's not an infection, it's a condition where the bones have been asked to carry too much weight during the growth phase, and the blood supply to the bone gets messed up. And that animal will be lame and will never recover. And if we grow gilts full throttle, let's say, from birth to breeding, that can happen. Because these animals are very healthy and very fast growing. So that's one important point. We think that there's a trend and have seen some success growing gilts faster to 90 to 100 kilos and then slowing them down to avoid that osteochondrosis. In addition to that, if we have a herd with high lameness causing a lot of loss of sows, we, I think, have to really hone in on gilt selection criteria. A gilt that walks into your barn prior to breeding and has toes that are already curled or uneven or too long or too short or pointing the wrong direction, don't let her in. She will not last. She will be a lameness call or mortality, okay? I would make the case that the toes have to be as perfect as possible, whether you're making your own gilts or buying them from someone else. And we can control that. We can control that by selection, because there is some heritability to feet and legs, but we also can control it by our environment. So gilts need to get on concrete. Concrete, is not natural for a pig, but it wears the toes down in a way that is natural for how a pig would live outside. The flooring needs to be dry. That's so that we don't have slipping and sliding, leading to injuries. And it's also so that we don't have infections in the skin at the bottom of the foot or through the wall of the hoof itself from standing in wet manure with bacteria all the time, okay? And then we need the square footage because these pigs do not tolerate being crowded up. If they don't get into the vice behavior, which we all hate, they will have more foot and leg injuries, and they'll have abnormal foot and leg growth if they're crowded. So your genetics company has a recommendation on the density for rearing the gilts and follow it. It'll contribute to better feet and legs. So I wanted to say a little bit about lameness there, and I wanted to just summarize a few key takeaways before I open it up for discussion or questions. In spite of the fact that Ontario is doing great, our industry globally needs to continue to talk about the problem of sow mortality. It's hard to produce pigs efficiently and cost efficiently with high sow mortality. They're not leaving the farm at a good time if it's 2 weeks before they fair, obviously. And in addition to that, our customers probably don't like the level of mortality we have, and they would expect it to be lower. So we need to be aware of that. Having said that, Ontario is doing a great job. We have smaller farms, we have very good owner operators, we have very good barn staff, and that is the key. We also do have less severe PRRS in some areas. I need to mention that. Although I know it doesn't feel like that for those of you who've had PRRS the last few years. Gilt development, especially weight as service, is a takeaway. If you do one new thing on your farm to lower your sow mortality, this is it. Weigh your gilts at service and get the target. It just impacts so many things down their life. Investments in stock people skill and training will pay off. I don't like this term which we sometimes use where we talk about unskilled labor. I say there's no such thing in a sow barn. Even the guy who just pressure washes, if he's doing that in an unskilled way, you're going to have a scours outbreak. So everybody in the barn is skilled, and everybody in the barn is involved with sow care, okay? And so is there room to reframe that discussion on your farm to bring the level of sow care up? There may be. Think about it. I encourage you. I encourage you to try to not use unknown as a cause of sow death. Let's make them sudden deaths or off feed. Let's see if we can, clean our data up, make it usable. And there are still many unanswered questions about sow mortality. We still do not understand the full impact of our fairly rapid, forced, let's say, transition to loose housing. We still don't understand enough about pelvic organ prolapse or lameness. And so before I sign off, I want to let you know that the University of Guelph has been funded to launch a big sow mortality study. We're helping them. We are going to be talking with you and asking for your permission to use information about your farm, from your farm, completely anonymous. No one from the university will know your name or where you live or what the names of your kids or your boars or your sows are. But it's important to bring this anonymous information together, to study the problem, to show to our customers that the problem's important to us, and more importantly, to bring some more applied research home to the farm. So we'll be asking for your consent. Look forward to having a conversation with you about that in the coming months. I just want to acknowledge the team. So Paul, Courtney, Shalimar, and Jillian have all helped me a lot. In the bad old days, I would have stayed up till like 1 a.m. putting slides together, and they basically did the whole thing. I just have to stand here. So thanks, team. And I don't know if there's time for questions, but I hope there is, because I'd love to hear from you.
Thanks, Greg. That was really interesting. I just have a curiosity question, I guess. Are you finding that there, and I don't want to specify genetic lines, but is there more problems with pelvic organ prolapses in specific genetic lines versus others? Like, I run a 2600 sow unit. We have some prolapses, but it's really not. It was an issue before we started your protocol last year, and it has worked really well for us. But we still have the odd one. But it seems like overall in the industry, it's a real issue. So is there a genetic connection, do you think?
So my completely honest answer to that question is that I do not think there is a genetics company that is worse than others. The problem is too unpredictable to fit such a simplistic kind of solution. But any sow that is very lean and very prone to losing weight or being unfit at the time of farrowing is a risk. And that includes actually all of the common genetics companies in the province.
From my perspective, the ones that, generally speaking, that do prolapse tend to be my fat sows.
Yeah.
Rather than skinny or really lean sows, it's generally fat sows.
I've heard that from others too, and I've also heard people say, yeah, it's not the ones that have the big bulgy perineum that prolapse, it's anyone. So it just speaks to how we don't understand it well. But I am really encouraged to hear that protocol, that medical protocol is helping you.
Yeah.
I asked our pharmacy guy, and I think my guess is we're probably treating 90 sows a month in the practice with that protocol based on the sales of the medicines we use. So.
Yeah, I would say we treat probably 5 or 6 a month.
Okay.
And with good results. We get the odd one that prolapses out and we just missed it, right?
Yeah.
There were no signs, but the ones that we do treat, we almost always manage to farrow out, and they usually lean pigs, so.
Awesome. Thank you for that.
Good presentation, Greg.
Oh,
No more easy questions, though. So you mentioned in the feeding styles, shoulder stalls. I think you said there's only 3 out of 20 that they have to kind of fight for their feet. Shoulder stalls, that's not counted as having to sort of compete for feed.
Yeah, in shoulder stalls, they do compete for feed, or they can. There's a big difference between different setups there. So I think in my presentation, you saw a barn that was completely retrofitted with really nice shoulder stalls in fairly small groups. That's a sweet setup. It's a lot harder to kind of cut the existing stalls off to make shoulder stalls. So, but there can be competition. It's easy for a sow to duck out and try and steal their neighbor's feed.
So that was one question. The other one was, I know that we're doing really well in Ontario, and it's not surprising. It's definitely related to the size of the herds and attention to detail. But in Manitoba versus Ontario, I wonder how do we do? And I wonder, is there any impact on the use of fiber in diets for all these various issues like prolapses and condition scoring and all these things?
Well, there's very few nutritionists in the room, so I will respond to a nutrition-related question. I think fiber is very important. You know, I think you go to farms where sows won't defecate normally for many days after farrowing, right? And could fiber play a role in improving that? I think so. In Denmark, they use a lot of like forages in that transition period. Now, it's obviously not made their sow mortality problem go away, but when you talk to people there, they say on a farm level, it's really important. So, yeah, I think there's something about fiber.
There was one slide on that sow anemia, but I thought that was interesting. And I know you're just started kind of delving into that, but where do you see that going over the course of the next year?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I'd like to repeat it here. That study was done on one farm with one genotype on one type of feed in South Dakota. And the results were very significant to the point where we look at it and say, really? And so then when we say that, the next step is we got to do it ourselves. So that's where I see that going in the next year. And the person who did their master's there, she's staying on at South Dakota State to do a PhD. So she's going to do a whole bunch more work too. So I think we'll get further on that next year.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Greg. I really appreciate all of your insight there. Let's give one round of applause.